Hello, Kim.
Hi, David. So nice to see you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know we've been kind of communicating through social media for a little while at least, and you participated in Gym Fanning Friday this year as well.
Oh, that was so fun. And I was very grateful to you for your tutorial on how to tie a bow tie. Next year, I'm going to actually try and tie it, which will probably be a disaster, but I'm going to give it a go.
I did that video because I was sick myself of having to look up on YouTube how to tie a bow tie. And
Right.
every time not finding the right video. So I thought,
Yeah.
right, and having to use about three to kind of figure it out. So I was just like, right, I'm going to make one. And now I can refer back to it because for some reason it just won't go in my head how to
Yeah.
do it. And considering I'm a teacher by training, like yourself, really, we're both in education, aren't we?
Yeah. Well, I could tell from your video, I thought, I think he's a teacher because like you were so good at kind of explaining clearly each step.
Oh, thank
Yeah,
you.
it was teacher vibes.
Yeah, but for some reason it still doesn't go in my head. So clearly I'm not very good at teaching from memory. Anyway, let's talk about your Bond book anyway, which I had the pleasure of reading a few weeks ago now. And yeah, there's just so much to talk about, but let's actually just back up just for a second to your previous book, and I think I can see the cover art actually. Is that
Yeah.
a large version of the cover art behind you?
Yeah,
Just
it's a gigantic version that they printed for the book launch. And then at the end of the book launch, I said, "Oh, what do you do with that?" And they said, "Oh, we recycle them." I thought, "No, you can't. You can't recycle my beautiful cover." So I took it with me. But now it's really awkward because I just have this like giant book cover wherever I go.
it's not awkward. It's not awkward. It's gorgeous. I've got the small version behind me on the shelf there. So I really enjoyed your book. I did find it quite emotionally overwhelming. Unlike the Bond book, which I read in under 3 days, I think I had to space it out because I was finding it so emotionally overwhelming.
Yeah.
Because some of the material in there, I thought it was brilliant though. But in that, even in that book, James Bond appears.
Yeah.
There's some direct and less direct. So
Mhm.
some for the super fans references to James Bond. So
Mhm.
was that something you thought, okay, I want to put James Bond in this book, or did you just find him kind of like it does into my life? James Bond just creeps into everything.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that was funny because when I first sort of was in touch with the Fleming estate, they said, "Oh yes, we noticed, we noticed the references in Testament." Um, so I think it was probably a bit of both. So in Testament, there's the character of Eva who wants to be a filmmaker and is sort of a film student, and she's particularly interested in British film history. So I felt like that was an area where, I mean, there's many areas where Eva as a character and myself intersect, but I felt like that was an area where my love of Bond could kind of filter in.
Mm.
And also, I wrote Testament after my grandfather passed away, and we were very close. And writing the book was sort of a way for me to process that grief and also sort of document in a way how important that relationship was to me. And he was an actor, George Baker, and he appeared in a few Bond films. And so I think that was also kind of on my mind when I was writing the novel, because after he died, I revisited his films. And that's such a gift, and that's something that not a lot of people have. Having lost him, I can still hear his voice, I can still see his moving image. So that meant a lot to me to be able to go back to those Bond films. So I think that partly it just filtered in because, as you say, if you're sort of obsessed with something as we are with Bond, it kind of just comes into your life. But also I think it was particularly on my mind because of my grandfather when I was writing the book.
Yeah, absolutely. Which just incidentally, and sorry if I don't recollect anyone asking you this one before, but which of these Bond performances is your favorite? On Her Majesty's or Spy Who
Oh,
Loved
that's a good question. um it would be hard to choose. Neither was anything like him really in person, and he's doing different voices for both. His accent was a little different. But I think in On Her Majesty's, he has the twinkle in his eye, which is most like him. He was very charming and sort of very twinkly eyed. And I think, you can see that in On Her Majesty's. So probably that one. And I think I also really love how subversive that whole strand is really for a Bond film. So I've always been proud that he was part of that. And his voice kind of appears in the film, sort of dubbing Lazenby in certain moments. So that's always been fun for me as well, listening really keenly and thinking, oh, that's George. Oh, yeah, that's George. So I enjoy that part as well.
I think when I did my in-depth look at On Her Majesty's Secret Service, I timed it as about 40 minutes that your grandfather
Yeah,
appears in that film.
yeah,
So
because
he's
he
only
was,
in that one scene, and it's a
yeah,
really important scene.
yeah,
I think there was a deleted scene as well, which I don't think has ever seen the light of day. I've never
mm,
seen it. So there is a little bit more performance somewhere in the Eon archives.
yeah.
There is about 40 minutes, he dubs George Lazenby.
Yeah, yeah, and that was sort of funny for him because he, as a young man, when they were first casting Bond,
Mm.
he met Ian Fleming and Broccoli in a restaurant, and Ian Fleming came over to talk to him and then said to Broccoli, "Oh, this is my Bond," and really wanted him, but he was tied up in a 6-picture studio contract which he couldn't get out of to play Bond, which he, in some ways, I think he was quite glad about, because he always considered himself a character actor, and I think he was quite grateful in a sense not to have that beginning role sort of define what he could do for the rest of his career. And then he went on to be Inspector Wexford for Ruth Rendell, and other things kind of in the crime genre. But I think that always made him laugh that Ian Fleming had sort of pointed to him and said, "You're my Bond," and then he went on to sort of voice quite a significant part of it for Lazenby.
Yeah. You are, if anyone was in any doubt, you are a true Bond aficionado. You are a Bond super geek, like most of the people who will. I think everyone will enjoy your book, but particularly the super geeks are going to enjoy your book because there are some deep cuts in there.
Yeah.
Like real Fleming references, which I was just like, honestly, and I won't obviously give anything away in this, no spoilers here, but I was giddy with glee when certain characters were in it, and I was just, oh my gosh, yeah, this person gets Bond, and then some. But you even, and this could be a bit divisive, but in one of your recent missives on the Girl with the Golden Pen, which I really enjoy reading, you started to defend Die Another Day, or
Yeah.
weren't you questioning whether it was actually now a good film, or whether it was because you'd had 4 glasses of champagne while you were watching it? Is that correct?
It could have been the champagne. Some very nice people got me very drunk, and then I thought the best thing to do in this moment is watch Die Another Day.
Of course.
But that film's always been really special for me because it's the first I saw in the cinema, the first Bond film I saw in the cinema. So it holds that place for me in my memory. But also the night I went to see it, it was for I'm not sure if it would have been my 12th birthday or my 13th birthday, but it was for my birthday, and I was going with one of my best friends growing up, who was a little bit older than me, and he was a really big Bond fan, and he was quite instrumental in introducing me to Bond. And his birthday present to me was to take me to see Die Another Day for the opening night. But he became a father quite young, and his son was born premature, really quite significantly premature that day. And he was in the NICU, and they sort of said, there's nothing you can do for a few hours, so you just need to wait and find out if he'll be okay, really. So it was just this really very difficult waiting game. So I had thought, of course, we won't go to the cinema, but then my friend said, actually, it'd be nice just to have a distraction, and you can't do anything for a few hours. So we went, and turn phones off if we even had. I think he did have a phone then. And we watched the film, and I really enjoyed it. I was sort of young enough not to spot the kind of dodgy CGI and all of those things. And I thought it's great, and I came out bouncing and was like, wasn't that fantastic? And I remember he looked so sort of pale and ghostly, and I realized he hasn't absorbed a minute of this film. His mind's just been on what's happening. And then I think he turned on his phone. I think it was a mobile, or somehow he checked back in with his family and found out, yes, your son's going to be okay. So that huge moment of relief. And his son will actually come along with him to the book launch, which is nice. So that for me was this very special, very sort of intense and emotional way to first see Bond in a cinema. So it always had that kind of glow for me. But of course, it's not the most beloved by people as a Bond film. But I do think, rewatching it, I do think there are elements of it that are really unusual and brave, and things that you don't see in other Bond films. To open the film with him being captured and sort of failing in a way, and then being in captivity for a long time, and being tortured, and also being tortured by a woman. I think there's an interesting thing there for his character. And then to see him, with his long hair and his beard and his holy t-shirt, and in a way we don't get to see Bond, really that beaten up again until quite late in the Daniel Craig era. So I've always thought that was a really brave opening. And then also what they're doing with a slightly older Bond, and there's a kind of reflection on his relationships not lasting, and a sort of question from M about what really is the point of you, which again we have in the Daniel Craig era and is really celebrated, and perhaps was just a little bit too early in Die Another Day. And I also love, how his relationship with women is teased out through Frost and Jinx, and how much it matters to him to rescue Jinx at the end. It really matters to him. So I think there's a lot in there, there's a lot in there that, maybe hasn't stood the test of time, or perhaps didn't even stand its release very well. But I think there are also things in there worth celebrating that maybe people have forgotten amongst, the invisible car and the tidal wave and all of those things.
I know, I see all those things. I must admit, when I saw it for the first time, when it was released, 20 years ago now, but I walked out the cinema feeling a bit betrayed. So I don't have that same kind of nostalgia as you.
Yeah.
But on subsequent reviewings, especially when I wrote my article, I was, and I wrote about 10,000 words about it in the end. I just found there's so much to write about.
Yeah.
For a lot of the things that you've just said there, particularly Miranda Frost, I could just watch the Miranda Frost scenes all day.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think people do need to look past all the superficial kind of CGI mess and all that sort of stuff. There's a really good story and dialogue going on there.
Yeah, absolutely.
So turning to Double or Nothing, inevitably, I think people are going to make a big deal of a woman writing in the world of Bond. I know that we had the Moneypenny Diaries. Those books I really enjoy. I hope no one out there is going to express sentiments along the lines of Roger Moore's Bond when he meets Dr. Goodhead in Moonraker, a woman. So I'm sure there will be a few, and I'm sure you've braced yourself for that. But have you thought much about that?
Well, it's an interesting one because on the one hand, and I'll be saying on the one hand and on the other a lot, I'm a Libran, so that's my mode. But on the one hand, I feel like, of course, nobody would ever say to Anthony Horowitz or Sebastian Faulks, "Oh, what's it like writing Bond as a man?" It wouldn't occur to people. But that's because it has been traditionally quite dominated by male creators. And of course, originates with Ian Fleming. Although there is this really rich tradition of women in the world of Bond, which I feel really proud to be a part of, going right back to Johanna Harwood, co-writing the first two films. So I think that tradition is there, but of course it's natural with Bond as a character and with the history of Bond for people to say, oh, look, they've chosen a female writer. So I completely understand people pointing that out. And I think it does bring a different perspective, coming to it as a woman. I feel like I'm coming to it first and foremost as a Bond fan, rather than sort of, or let me sit down as a woman and write this book, so that sort of thought isn't on my mind. But I can completely understand why people, might be even surprised by it, and I hope that this is just another step in that sort of very rich legacy of women in Bond.
I mean, as you probably know from my posts and stuff, I find the whole idea of gender stereotyping just utterly ridiculous in all of its forms.
Yeah.
And in another recent issue of your Girl with Golden Pen Substack, you talked about the famous five and identifying mostly with George, the tomboy character. Can I just say, me too? Yeah.
Brilliant.
I love those books growing up.
Yeah.
And it was either her or Timmy the dog who I identify with. Never identify with Julian or Dick or Anne really all that much. But I presume you kind of get quite irked by gender stereotyping as well.
Yes, and George was a big thing for me growing up because there was a girl with short hair. I've always had short hair. There was a girl with short hair who was leading the adventures, and she was brave and resourceful, and she didn't need rescuing, and she basically owned an island. So there was something to aspire to. And I didn't really see that much in other sort of stories I was consuming. growing up, I was always considered, that sort of tomboy. And I had short hair, and I loved Bond, and I loved Batman, and I loved playing football. And I found it so baffling that people found it baffling, because those were just the things I loved. And what did it matter that I was a girl, not a boy? So that was a sort of big conflict for me as a child, that it seemed like the things I loved and wanted to pursue weren't really acceptable in the eyes of society. I was really lucky to grow up in a home where it was completely acceptable to my family, and nobody made a big thing of it. When I wanted to shave my head when I was 10, my mom said, okay, you go for it. So I was really lucky to have a family who just never made a thing about it. But I was certainly aware outside of my home that those stereotypes were something that I had to confront. And I think, that follows you even as you go into adulthood. It's just other stereotypes come along. So I hope that with, again, I feel so grateful to the Fleming estate having chosen me to do this, because I feel like it's another way to sort of defy stereotypes and to say, as you do so brilliantly on your podcast and in your essays, Bond is for everybody. Bond can be for everybody.
I think a lot of people still have that idea that Bond is like the ultimate man's man.
Right.
And, for me, I think the reason I've always connected with Bond is because I see it as kind of having masculine and feminine qualities.
Absolutely.
Again, without going into spoilers about particular characters, there is a female character in your book who has passed as a boy in previous mission. I like that detail. I thought that was really, really interesting, and as you were talking, it just brought that back to me, actually. So
that's interesting. Nobody else has asked about that, and I think when I put that in, I was thinking about the and I think this is true for a few different characters, the usefulness for a spy of ambiguity and ambivalence, and being able to pass in different communities and transition through different societies without being identified. And of course, in some ways that goes against, the Bond thing, where he's always just constantly telling people his real name and sticking
a tuxedo to place.
Exactly. But I felt like, with these other 00 characters, and I think it's okay for us to get into sort of some, some spoilerish, from the beginning of the book, no, don't worry, folks, nothing too big. But so that's Harwood's character, 003, and I think I put that in there because she is a character who has a duality to her. She's maybe her biggest skill is a kind of adaptability, being able to adapt to whatever the person across from her needs her to be, which makes her very persuasive, because she can sort of attune to people. And also just, from it probably came in there from my experience as well. I was constantly being mistaken for a boy when I was little, which, could be annoying, but also could sometimes work to my favor. I used to get really cheap haircuts in barbers because they thought I was a boy. And I remember once asking the barber, would you cut my hair if I was a girl? And he said, oh no, we don't do girls. Yes. £7 haircut.
Early spying experience there.
Exactly.
It works the other way around as well. I buy women's facial care products because they are half the price of men's.
Yes, and much nicer usually.
There we go. And they smell a lot nicer as well. So being as we're kind of talking about the 00 characters, and I feel almost as if I'm about to breach the Official Secrets Act here. Have paratroopers from the Ian Fleming guys kind of swoop through the skylight here. But you do have a very diverse cast of 00s, and I've even months ago, before I was able to read the proof of your book, I've been saying on podcasts, my money's on Kim Sherwood coming through in terms of diversity in the Bond stories, because it's somewhat lacking in some other versions. And I know that there have been strides made in recent years, but this is not so much strides as like giant leaps. This really. So again, was that something kind of conscious, or was it something that you just thought this just fits?
Sort of a bit of both. I began to think, when I was invited to do this, one of the things that the Flemings wanted was for me to expand the cast of characters and have these new 00 heroes. So I began to think about, if you took it sort of as real as possible, almost like when Christopher Nolan took on Batman and he said, what if this was real life? So thinking about it from that angle. Of course, if you're going to have a group of 00s, you're going to need them to go undercover all over the world amongst all sorts of communities. So it just makes sense to have a diverse group of spies, which I think is true of MI6 as well. I went on their website to look at kind of who are they recruiting, and they certainly are trying to be as diverse as possible, I'm sure, for practical reasons as well as political reasons. So I began with that sort of that focus, where can they go undercover, what missions can they go on, and then also wanting to, as you say, wanting to kind of widen the representation of the Bond universe. As I say, I was always a massive fan, going right back to being a kid, and it was Bond I fantasized being. I didn't want to be one of the women, as amazing as the female characters are. I didn't want to be rescued. I wanted to be the hero. So I thought this is an opportunity to allow more readers to see themselves as the hero, and to have, especially as I have multiple leads, to have characters from all of these different backgrounds and walks of life.
Absolutely. Are we allowed to talk about Dryden? Because that's the one where I'm just waiting for paratroopers.
No, that's fine. I feel like of all people, I should,
I know,
talk with you about it.
As soon as it got to page whatever it was, I put a post-it note in the page it happened, because I just keep going back to that part. And as soon as it got to that part, and I was just like, okay, we've got a gay 00. Okay, we actually have a gay 00, everybody. I mean, that's like, all those kind of awful kind of clickbait articles that you get about, I just know there's going to be one that says, we've got the first gay 00, and I just know that that's going to be one of those articles. And I cannot tell you honestly how, I know I messaged you on Instagram as soon as I read it, but I cannot tell you how validating and exciting and just kind of overwhelmingly, I felt quite emotional when I got to that part, to be perfectly honest, because like you, I never fantasized about being anyone other than Bond, but he's ostensibly a heterosexual character, but he's also quite a blank slate in a lot of ways. But a lot of people sees heterosexuality as like, so defining of the character. I don't really. But yeah, to have a gay 00, and that was just, it's not really a question. It's just like, I just needed to get it out there. I just need you to know how that's going to be set, and it won't just be me. I know there were going to be, when I started Licensed to Queer, I thought I was in a small group of queer James Bond fans, and it turns out there are lots and lots of us, which is great, and it's going to mean so much to so many people.
Oh, thank you. That's really lovely to hear. Thank you. And I, with his character, I've been hearing from a lot of people that he's their favorite character, and that's so lovely for me to hear, because I knew I was in some ways taking a risk with that choice, because, as you say, of how the world of Bond is perceived, not necessarily how it actually is from my perspective, but maybe how it's perceived more broadly as being quite heteronormative in some ways.
Yes.
So I knew it was in some ways a risk, but I felt like it was important, not only, as I was saying, to make the world of Bond kind of more inclusive and to sort of open the door a bit more, but also it just sort of came to me through the character and the story. I knew I wanted to write about this quite common route for soldiers. It's quite common for sort of special operators, people in the SAS, and that kind of elite level of soldier who will serve hundreds of individual missions in their career, and they'll do multiple tours. They are so skilled, and they've been doing this since they were 16, but their bodies eventually will give out on them, to have that level of frontline action. It's quite common for those operators to go to MI6 and to become spies. And I thought that's really interesting. And of course, for the 00s, if you were recruiting, that's your perfect recruit, really, somebody with all of that experience. So I wanted to bring that in. And then I was thinking about, what can I sort of draw on from his army life? And the character's called Joseph Dryden, he's 004. And I thought it would be really interesting if he had this love interest from his army days, if this sort of great love of his life was a comrade in his unit. So it sort of came from that thinking. And then I thought, what if that love interest had in a way gone to the dark side? Things hadn't panned out so well for him when he left the army. He hadn't had that safety net catch him, and he'd ended up being a sort of mercenary for perhaps somebody with sinister intent, and they come together through that again. Because I've always found it's great when Bond meets somebody and they strike up a flirtation, and 5 minutes later they're allies and in bed together. That's Bond's skill. But I always thought it's really interesting when it's someone from your past. I love Terry Hatcher's character in Tomorrow Never Dies for that reason. I love when it's an ex, and it's got all this emotional history. So I thought I really want to include that, and not to have it be, in quotes, the Bond girl, but rather have it be a man.
And the other characters, there's a degree of tension with a few of the kind of the person that Luke's working with, some of his underlings there, and you don't shy away from kind of homophobia existing in the world. But with most characters, especially the MI6 people, it's just acceptance, which I think is so important, as you say, probably quite representative of reality. It's interesting you say Terry Hatcher, because that was my first thought was Paris Carver.
Right, yeah.
Never Dies is one of my favorite Bond films. And I thought it was that sort of dynamic, and it's honestly, it's just so exciting having that that story convention turned on its head in a really kind of subtle way, and you don't shy away from the romance and the sex scenes and everything else. It's just so beautifully written. So thank you, really.
Well, thank you. It's really lovely to hear.
And that doesn't diminish the other double O's, of course, because they're all fascinating, and I really don't. Talking about the other two might kind of verge a bit more into spoiler territory, because allegiances and all that sort of thing. But Joanna Harwood, you mentioned her earlier on. She's still alive, isn't she? The real Joanna Harwood. And it's only now that her contribution to Bond is really being recognised. And I am adamant that we wouldn't have the Bond we have today without Joanna Harwood's contribution. From my research, she started and finished the Dr. No script, and then there were a load of men in the middle that kind of messed it around, and then she had it back and went, right, let's take it back to Fleming.
Let's fix this.
So a great way to honor her. I said the other chap, Bashir, is that did I read it or did I imagine it that's a Star Trek reference?
That is a Star Trek reference.
Because my husband is a huge Star Trek fan. He was like, well, clearly that's Bashir when he dresses up as Bond in Deep Space Nine. I was like, okay, that one went over my head. Yeah,
well, that was one of my first introductions to Bond, that brilliant episode of Deep Space Nine. And I always thought that he'd make a fantastic Bond, that actor. So I kind of wanted to do a little nod to that with Bashir's character.
Lovely. I suppose, like all continuation authors, you kind of, the shadow of Fleming looms to a degree, and it's like, to what extent do I sort of try to ape his style or do it my own way? And I know, didn't Sebastian Faulks wrote as Ian Fleming, didn't he? So he's rather more self-consciously kind of emulated the style of Fleming. But there is, there are, as I say, there are real Fleming geek out moments in this. There are a couple I missed. I've read it twice now, and there are a couple I missed on my first reading. But how conscious were you of sort of emulating Fleming and doing it? What was the sort of balance you went for?
Yeah, I thought about that a lot, because I thought, I can only write like me. I can't write like Ian Fleming. There's only one Ian Fleming, but he's always been a big influence on me. So I first read Fleming when I was about 12. And I read all of the books, and I loved them as a teenager, and I've kept rereading them. And I think that has had an impact on my writing and on my style. So I thought about where there might be a kind of shared DNA between my style and Fleming's style. He was a very visual writer in a way that I think the films kind of borrow from. Color is very important to him. He's very sort of vivid imagery. He also uses quite uncanny imagery. He makes things quite strange and uncomfortable. I was interested in that. And I really love imagery in my writing, and I'm, my editor's always saying, okay, can we not have 10 per page? Can we maybe just have 5 per page? So I'm always sort of editing for that. But I thought that's an area where he's influenced me. And I also thought a lot about point of view. So he uses a kind of omniscient point of view. He can get into the kind of heads of multiple characters. And I thought that really helps me, because I have these sort of multiple strands in the book. We have 003 Harwood and 009 Bashir sort of on one mission together, and then we have 004 Dryden on another mission, and then they sort of intersect in different ways. But because of that, I was going to be occupying a lot of different voices and a lot of different minds. And I thought, well, I'll sort of borrow from Fleming in that sense and use the omniscient point of view to let me do that. So it wasn't so much trying to ape him, I would say, but more pay homage and think about where he has influenced me and where I could kind of bring our writing to perhaps speak to each other, be in relationship to each other.
Yeah, to me, never felt like a pastiche, which sometimes when people sort of writing Bond, it's like, oh, that's very self-consciously Fleming style.
Yeah.
And it felt, although there's all those Fleming kind of geek out moments and callbacks and all that sort of thing, it felt so fresh to me.
Thank you.
And it's really, I love anything Bond, even people, the films that people say are bad and the books and whatever. I love it all.
Yeah.
And I think that's the best way to be as a Bond fan. You just love it all, and you just love some of it more than others.
Yeah.
But some of it does sometimes feel like it's not moving things on in a way. Whereas I know the press release, and I think it's an understatement, actually, says it blows the world of James Bond wide open. There are so many moments especially in the first 100 pages, but also later on, where you just go, why has no one thought of doing that on before? And it's just so daring. Like, again, I don't know how many specific, we're kind of treading on page 50 territory here, but what Moneypenny's doing, what Q is, and I'm just like, whoa, this is fresh stuff. This is
well, with those sort of moments, I was really grateful to the Fleming estate, because they were really encouraging of me just to sort of push the boundaries, and they wanted it to be set in the present day. They wanted it to feel contemporary, to feel fresh. And so they kind of said to me, we've chosen you, we trust you, run with it. And so I was really grateful to them for letting me make some changes. So yeah, with Moneypenny, I think it's fine to say that Moneypenny is now head of the 00 section, because I felt like there was an interesting thing where in the books M is head of the 00 section, but then in the films M is head of MI6, eventually sort of framed that way. So I thought, well, then there can be 2 people in charge, and I can still have an M. My M is a different M, but I can still have M in charge of MI6, and I can promote Moneypenny, and Moneypenny can head up the 00 section, because she's essentially been a secretary, since the 50s. And I feel like, that's enough training. She could be promoted by now. So also, I think, in our sort of cultural unconscious, we bestow Moneypenny with a lot of authority, because she is the person, in some ways, even more than M, Moneypenny is the person Bond comes home to. And so she has that role in his life. And I felt like that gives her a power for the viewer and for the reader. So I thought, let's kind of shift her up. And then with Q, I think it's fine to say, Q is now a quantum computer, which kind of came about because I was thinking about technology and how Fleming was really interested in sort of what was cutting edge, what was just happening, and the same with the films, perhaps even more so. They've really pushed that and looked at sort of latest developments in technology. And MI6 and other kind of intelligence organizations are using quantum computing to fight terror, to sort of crunch these massive data sets about financial transactions for terrorists and all these things. So I thought, what if MI6 was sort of doing that, and Q was actually just a quantum computer with a team of people, around it. So in a sense, you have sort of multiple characters there. But that seemed kind of fun to me, and luckily the Flemings were on board with it.
That is a bold reinvention. It was another one of those moments where I just stared at the page going, what? Honestly, so amazing. And your MI6 is I think you've probably got more MI6 characters in your book than any other Bond story.
Mm.
And I always think MI6 feels very familial. It is very, very much like a family. I know some people don't like that. People like to think of Bond as a lone wolf, but I've always argued that that's not really the character. He's always had this support network around him. Do you
Absolutely.
think the same? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, of course, you have a few stories where he's sort of rogue or by himself, but he always eventually comes back into the fold, and they give him the key to go onto the bridge and take, and he's back in again. And I do think that the way we, if you ask someone, oh, what comes along in a Bond story, yes, they'll say, the Martini and the Aston Martin and all those things, but they'll also say M and Moneypenny and Q. It's the family unit around him. And I think that that's clear both in the books, particularly in the books, in the Bond M relationship, how in a way there's a father-son dynamic, and Bond reflects on how he kind of gives all of his love and obedience to this man, and will sort of do whatever M asks him to do, even times where it makes him uncomfortable. He has that faith in M, and I think you see that in Bernard Lee's performance as well, from the very beginning, to the point that when he stepped down from being Q and being M, and other actors kind of stepped into that role, and they were a bit gruffer and less caring, I didn't like it. I felt like, oh no, he's supposed to be stern, but he's also supposed to be loving. That was the way I saw him. And I thought that Judi Dench did that so brilliantly. And I love watching Judi Dench's evolution of her relationship, both with Brosnan's Bond and with Daniel Craig's Bond, shifting into a kind of motherly relationship in some ways, but going from kind of, you're a misogynistic relic of the Cold War and you're a dinosaur, to you're the one thing I got right in my life. That arc is just so beautiful, and I think very familial.
I think it reaches its peak quite early in Tomorrow Never Dies with the it's almost like Bond is like the naughty child, and Moneypenny's the good. There's like a sister the dynamic, and the mother, and don't ask, don't tell. It's like we're not going to share. We'll just keep that on the down low. It's fine.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love that as well. I mean, Bond himself, no spoilers. It's right there on there. James Bond is missing in your story, but he permeates the book. Because each character has their own personal connection with him. I mean, Dryden has never, less so Dryden, but the other characters. So was it fun seeing Bond through, you talked about point of view, and it's an omniscient point of view, but everyone has a different point of view of Bond. And so was it sort of fun seeing Bond through the eyes of so many different people?
Very much so. And I think that's something I always really appreciate when Fleming does. So The Spy Who Loved Me, which is a really unusual Bond novel, is actually one of my favorites, because you have this outside view on Bond. And I love when he does that in the other novels as well, particularly when we see Bond through the eyes of the woman he's, currently having a relationship with or flirting with. I really like those moments because we spend so much time in Bond's perspective, or kind of imbuing Bond with a sense of power and perhaps being infallible, and then you see him from someone else's perspective, and you see, he's often described as looking quite cruel, or looking like a villain, and that kind of takes you back, because you think, oh, this is my hero, and I really trust him. But you see him from someone else's perspective as a little unnerving at times, and I wanted to play on that. So when the Flemings asked me to do this, and they said, we want to have this kind of expanded cast of characters, I thought, well, what do you do with Bond? Because Bond is the star of the show. If he's on the page or if he's on the screen, that's who you're going to pay attention to, because it's James Bond. And I thought about him as a literal star, with his own gravity. I thought if he's there, everything is coming to his gravity. So if I'm sort of plotting a kind of James Bond universe, if I'm expanding this, and he's at the center and he's the star of it, where do the other characters sit in relation to his gravity? So a character like Johanna Harwood, who's had a sort of this comes up pretty quickly, so we can say a romantic relationship with him in the past. She's very close to his star, and Bashir, Bond was kind of his mentor, so he's very close to Bond's star. Somebody like Dryden, Bond doesn't mean that much to him. He's concerned Bond is missing, because that means there's a security breach, and that's concerning. But otherwise, he has his own story going on, so his star would be sort of a little further away. And then that gave me the opportunity to think, when I am sort of close to his galaxy almost, how do those people perceive him? So I thought a lot about his and Moneypenny's relationship, the history between them, the trust between them, which is very unusual, I think, in Bond's life. To somebody like Harwood, who's seen him through this sort of romantic lens, how does she perceive him? Somebody like Bashir, who's kind of looked up to him, how does he perceive him? So that was really fun to play with. It also in some ways emulates, in a perhaps metafictional way, Bond in society, because everybody has an opinion on James Bond. So it's nice to kind of bake that into the story.
Absolutely. You talked about that galaxy universe analogy is really interesting, considering the fact that the sun is sort of, was that kind of playing on your mind, or was that a coincidence? Yeah,
that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that, but I think you're right. I've also sort of baked it into the plot in other ways. The plot's kind of about the climate crisis, and so the sun sort of plays a role. You're right, I hadn't thought about that, but yeah, I think that probably has played into the plot as well.
I mean, it is so thematically rich, and I do think that people sometimes give Ian Fleming short shrift, and I know in recent years it's kind of Fleming's been reevaluated more as literature. You know, it's appeared in, I think, Penguin Classics editions and that sort of thing. And also Fleming uses quite a lot of literary allusions, which sometimes I think people overlook. And there are a few allusions, happily, from some of my favorite books. So a bit of D.H. Lawrence in there.
Yeah.
So is D.H. Lawrence one of your favorites as well?
Yes. And that came to me. It's interesting that you pulled that out, because that came to me really early on, because I was thinking about how Fleming approached villains and conflict. And I think you're completely right. For me, I feel like, it would be hard to say Fleming is undervalued as a writer, because he's contributed one of the most iconic characters of all time to culture. So we can't say he's undervalued, but I would say that he's perhaps undervalued as a stylist. I think he's a beautiful writer. And you're completely right. A lot of his writing kind of comes with these allusions to other texts. Yeah. And Lady Chatterley's Lover came to me because I was thinking about the threats that Fleming wrote about. He often wrote about the big existential threats of his own time. And I felt like for us, the climate crisis is our big existential and very real threat today. And so I went back to that line from that sort of opening section from Lady Chatterley's Lover, which is one of my favorite books of Lawrence. And he talks about, ours is essentially a tragic age, so we refuse to take it tragically. The cataclysm has happened, but we go on. And the end of that section is, we're building up new habitats, new homes, new routes into the future, though the sky has fallen. And I like that link to Skyfall. But also I do feel that he was writing in the wake of a world war, but I think it really captures this peculiar moment in time that we're in now, where we know the cataclysm has happened, we know we're in crisis, but we keep on living, which in a way is a human instinct, but is perhaps also something of a denial on a government level, that perhaps it's not being taken as tragically and seriously as it ought to be. So it came to me there.
And it's Dryden who spots the literary allusion, and because I think it goes over the head of everyone else in the room. And he spots it. So sorry, just to jump back to Dryden, and I could talk about Dryden all day, but please. But was Dryden named after the poet, or was he named after? He was,
well, so I looked at, when I'm naming characters, I'll often think about where they're from, and then I do research into common names, either from when, if it's a first name, common first baby names when they were born and where they were born, or common surnames kind of in censuses and that kind of thing. And so I found Dryden as a family name in Jamaica. His family are from Jamaica. And I thought, that's nice, because it also gives me Dryden the poet, and it kind of links me into that literary history as well. So, that was the reason for that. And I didn't even think, it's so funny, I didn't even think about the character at the beginning of the film of Casino Royale, who of course is called Dryden, possibly spelled differently, I'm not sure. But then when the character names were introduced, everybody on Twitter was saying, it'll be the origin story of that character. And I was like, oh God, no, it's not. Completely did that by accident.
I did look up Dryden. My first thought was a poet, and I thought it might be something else. But there was a Jamaican doctor in the 19th century who came to
Yeah.
London, I think, as well. So
Yeah, it's quite a common name there. So
yeah.
that, that's sort of in my research. I'm always looking for what feels right for that time and place.
You also, just to touch on Dryden again as well. So I write a lot about intersectionality. So he's not just gay, he's not white, and he's also got a disability. And the treatment of disability in Bond is fascinating. So was that again was that just something that you thought when you were doing your research, you thought this is entirely realistic? Someone ex-military, they're quite likely to have had some kind of life-changing injury at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, again, it was sort of a bit of both. So I have a disability myself, and I felt like it's perhaps underrepresented in action in general, not only Bond. So I felt like this was an opportunity to again open that door. But I also was looking at, what are the reasons that these really high level military operators, what are the reasons they stop operating? And it's usually because they've been medically downgraded because of an injury sustained in the field. So I was then looking at, what would that injury look like? What are the sort of likeliest things to happen? And he sustains an injury to his hearing, which is one of the most common injuries that soldiers who served in Afghanistan and Iraq have sustained. So my research sort of led me there, and then I was really grateful to the Royal Medical Defence Centre, they're called, who treat soldiers and veterans with these issues. They talked to me for a long time about sort of what would the treatment look like, what would the effects be afterwards on your body, what would the effects be on your mental health, because I was really curious for that character. What is he carrying with him into being a 00? What is sort of, for somebody who perhaps has always been defined by the success of their body, by being able to sort of be a warrior, what is it like if your perception of your body changes? I sort of wanted to explore that.
Absolutely. And you clearly did, Fleming famously did an awful lot of research for his books, and you're clearly following in those footsteps. One thing that must have been really difficult, though, and again, you've written about this in The Girl with the Golden Pen, is that you couldn't visit the locations.
Yeah.
Because you're writing this during COVID lockdowns. So, and Fleming famously wrote travel columns and liked to visit your locations himself, and you've done that for other works. I would never have guessed that you hadn't been to those places. I've been lucky enough to have gone to a couple of those places myself, and I was like, oh, she's definitely been there then. But yeah, so how did you go about researching those places?
It was hard, yeah. So I mean, for some of them I thought, okay, I'll make my life easy and I'll choose places I have been in the past, and so when I go away, I'm not a journal keeper in regular life, but when I go away, I write about what I'm seeing, what I'm experiencing. So I went back to notes I made in Berlin, for example, which appears in the book. Went back to that. And I also kind of lent on Fleming a bit, for some of the places that I hadn't been. He, of course, has his 2 travel books, the Thrilling Cities books. And so that was a little bit of a way into me to see the history of those places from the perspective of someone of essentially M's generation. In my book, if we imagine M was real. So that kind of helped me. And then it's about finding details. Virginia Woolf is one of my favorite writers. She talks about finding the facts that engender for a project. So you're sort of looking for the little details and the little seeds that give rise to the scene, the story, how the character is going to feel. And if I haven't been to a place, it's hard to know what those are. So I talk to people who've been there as much as possible, read as much as possible, watch as much as possible, interview people. And I'm actually very fortunate that my dad happens to be really well traveled. He's a tour manager for rock and roll bands. So he has been anywhere in the world where music has played. So, for this, I was calling him up and saying, I don't suppose you've happened to be in the naming somewhere really, really random and remote. And he'd go, yep, many times. And I'd say, oh, can you tell me about it? And, it's then you're asking really specific questions like, what does a hotel corridor smell like there? Or what sounds can you hear when you wake up? Those are the sort of questions that as a writer you need answers to, because they help you make a place feel real. And that felt really important, particularly kind of being in Ian Fleming's shadow, because he had such a good journalistic eye. I think that's why his travel writing is so good. He made places feel so vivid and so real. So I was, keen to emulate that as much as possible.
That's really interesting, and there is again a sort of thrilling, silly sort of callback, which I sort of thought, oh, that sounds a bit familiar, but then it sent me scurrying for the Fleming shelf up there, just to check, really. There's so many other aspects of this book, but I almost don't want to bring up, because I know that people are just going to find them so surprising. I suppose a final one is you put M in Converse.
Yeah.
I had to reread that passage 3 times. I mean, of everything else, that's probably the most shocking thing in the whole book, Kim.
Yeah, I think.
There's another clickbait headline. Yeah. You won't believe what M wears on his feet in Double or Nothing.
Yeah, I thought a lot about M's look, because I wanted it to be a new M, because I felt like, there's Fleming's M, and then there's the M's we've had on the screen, and they're so iconic. And I didn't want to be almost feel like I was ventriloquizing those other characters, like trying to animate them on the page. So I thought, let's bring in a new M, and also we're used to that in Bond, that there'll be a new M. So I thought, let's bring in a new M. Well, how's he going to be different from the previous M's? And so I thought, well, one way is look, because we have a very particular look for M. And actually, so there were kind of 2 influences for his look. One is my cousin Mick. He doesn't know this, so this will be a surprise to him. He is an architect and a very dapper gentleman, very well dressed. And my image of Mick is always him. He runs an architecture firm, and it's in this big sort of tall building. And my image of him when I gone there to visit him is him running up and down stairs. And he's in his, I think Mick's probably in his 70s now, but him running up and down stairs in Converse, making everybody else look really, really unfit. So I thought, I want M to have that kind of cool energy. And also, so I was writing this in lockdown, and that was when Patrick Stewart was doing remember he read like a Shakespearean sonnet a day?
Oh, yes.
And I really enjoyed those in lockdown. And he's just so cool, Patrick Stewart. Like every single one of those videos, he was so well dressed. And I thought, I'm gonna cast Patrick Stewart in my mind for this role, and then just say to him, just wear your own clothes. We won't dress you. Just come in as you are, and that'll be great.
Do you think people will be in uproar about that, or the other elements of the book?
I think it's going to be the Converse that are most controversial.
I think so too. I'm not going to go anywhere near the end of the book, because that was also another one of those. So I think we're probably best leave it there. Let's not spoil it. And I'm not the sort of person who's always looking forward to the next thing. This book needs to be savored, I think, and read multiple times. But is there anything you'd like to say about, obviously not plot wise and whatever, is there anything you'd like to say about kind of where this might be going, the sort of, I don't know?
What can I say? Well, I think one of the pleasures for me as a writer with this is knowing that it's a trilogy, knowing from the outset that it's a trilogy. So there are kind of seeds in this, there are moments in this book that perhaps aren't as significant for book 1 as they'll transpire to be, for future books. So that was fun for me to kind of get to set an arc running, because I think, if people haven't read the novels, one thing they might be surprised by is that Bond's character has really more of an arc than you might expect from the films, or at least certainly from the films pre-Daniel Craig, where he does sort of age and time as a factor. But pre-Daniel Craig, I would say that cinematic Bond is almost like a fairy tale, in that he seems to exist outside of time, because we have, he kind of regenerates like the Doctor, and yet there are sometimes these allusions to his past adventures. So, in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, we have him handling all those, all the different props from the previous films, and same in Die Another Day, he comes across them again. Or even in GoldenEye, when a reference is made to Georgia and Russia, and he says, oh yes, I used to bomb in and out, which kind of sounds like he's talking about Connery, but he's not. So he's always kind of existed a little bit outside of time in a way.
I sometimes think of Bond as I've used the analogy of a palimpsest before.
Yes, that's so good.
So that the wax tablet is melted, but
Yeah.
you can still see what was there before.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think canon is anathema to Bond. It's just a bad idea.
Yeah. You can't sort it out. No,
it's just a nightmare. It's in the James Bond lexicon, Alan J. Porter identifies 28 separate continuities and essentially canon. Continuities for Bond.
Yeah.
I'm just I don't know if it's a modern tendency to try and make things fit into continuity, or if it's always been there, but I suppose with telling myths and that kind of thing, there's always multiple versions of the same story, and I see Bond in that way, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think with like the rise of the MCU, we're much more inclined now to see things as a wider universe and to try and work out, oh well, if that's true, how can that also be true, and how do these characters link up, and to think about it through the lens of continuity. But in many ways Bond sort of was a precursor to that, in that it's this long-running world where the lead actor might change but Moneypenny is the same, but you just sort of have to accept that and you go with it. But with having writing a trilogy, I could think in terms of arc. I could think in terms of where do I want to take these characters across a long story. So each book hopefully can be read discreetly, and people could just enjoy them on their own. But I really hope that people do read all three, because I'm planning it on that scale. I'm thinking about where are these characters going, and where might they end up, which is really exciting for me as a writer.
And that must be a really difficult balancing act, creating, because this is my complaint with a lot of modern films, including the MCU, that it needs to feel satisfying in its own right, which this definitely does, but it needs to have just the right amount of tantalizing kind of threads to lead into the next story, and sometimes I don't think they always get that balance right, whereas it must have been a really, really difficult tightrope walk to pull that one off.
It was hard. And there are things where people might say, oh, I wonder why that character appears just for a chapter or something, or I wonder why that story is mentioned as a sort of side note. But it's me kind of saying, hold this in your mind, because we'll come back to this, which was really fun for me to do, to get to plant those little Easter eggs.
Well, I'm really looking forward to the next installment, but I by that point I reckon I'll have read this another couple of times at least, so I'll have all those tantalizing threads ready to pick up for the next time. Thank you so much for your time, Kim. And I know things are at the time of recording this, things are about to ramp up massively.
Well, thank you. This has just been so lovely to chat with you, and I love what you're doing with the podcast and the website so much. So it's just such a pleasure to get to chat with you about it.
Thank you so much, Kim. Take care.
Thank you.